What's up guys, it's Austin with Hot Rod Heaven. Today I'm with Dennis to talk about his 1941 Studebaker. This car is pretty cool. You don't really see these around a lot, so I'm excited to jump into the history of the car, why Dennis wanted to get it, and how he got it to where it looks like this now. So let's get the camera on the tripod and talk to Dennis about this sweet ride.
Well, it all started back in like 2012, and having raced back in the 60s, I was a big fan of the Gassers. And I started looking on eBay, and I found this vehicle up in Wisconsin, and it was just a rolling chassis with a body, but most of the components were there. And I said, I want something different. Everybody's building Willys and, you know, Anglias and stuff like that for the nostalgia Gasser thing. And plus my grandmother had a 1941 Studebaker.
That's awesome.
It was a four-door, but as a kid, I can remember riding around in that. Had it brought down on a truck. It was delivered to a friend of mine's house, and I, of course, went over to see it, and my first impression was, oh my Lord, you've made a huge mistake. Yeah. It was really bad to the point where I wasn't going to build it. But I started just tinkering with it, a little bit, and 6.5 years later, a lot of help from a lot of good people. This is the end result, so I did build it. This is a big block Chevrolet. Started off as a 454, 4-bolt block, and it's been bored 60 thousandths of an inch and stroked 1/4 of an inch, which results in 496 cubic inches. My intentions when I built this car was to race it. And that was before I went overboard. Forged steel crankshaft. I put program billet main caps on all the mains, all ARP studs and bolts on everything. Howard's H-beam rods, JE pistons, King bearings, comp cams, solid roller camshaft, airflow research heads that were CNC ported, and bolted to that is a Hawaiian intake manifold with a Don Hampton prepared 671 blower, which is vintage correct. And then of course up on top is a pair of 750 CFM Edelbrock carburetors. The end result was we did 5 pulls on the dyno and ran between 802 and 820 horsepower on pump gas. The blower is only 5% overdriven because as the car got built, it was clear that it probably wasn't going to end up on the racetrack. Knowing I was going to drive it on the street, I was a little careful with the timing and the amount of boost and so forth. But it's still enough to get sideways real quick with this thing. Turbo 400 trans was built by Kenny Wells here in Orlando. He is a wizard on automatic transmissions, been doing it all his life. Headers were hand built by the guy that did a lot of my fab work. His name is Bill Clark, and I have him to thank for all the beautiful welds and such. But that's the engine, that's the drivetrain, and that's it.
With the exhaust, I see that you have the open headers, but what do you have running through it as well? Because obviously you don't always go
obviously when
here.
I decided I was going to drive it on the street, I figured out I can't run these straight headers. And I've had it uncorked a few times and it is really loud. I had to figure out a way to muffle it, and to do that you can see the pipe that was welded into the side of the collector. That goes back underneath the car and goes through a pair of Borla mufflers, and it's enough to quiet it down to make it at least tolerable.
So moving on to the exterior of the car, let's first talk about the paint, because this color is beautiful and I love all the details. And is the gold flake in there?
It's 18 karat gold leaf.
Okay.
That's what it is, and it's called variegated gold leaf, hence the different colors in it. And all this lettering was done by hand.
What is the D&D Racing? What is that?
That's Dennis and Diana.
Okay.
That's me and my wife.
That's
I had to
awesome.
do a little call out there, you know,
Yeah.
keep the peace. Paint is a 3-stage. It's real candy apple red. What's painted on is like a gold, you can see it, very metallic base that comes up through the paint in the sun. And then over that is several layers of toner, which is like a translucent, reddish tinted clear. And of course, the more you put on, the darker it becomes. And then on top of that is like 3 or 4 coats of clear. Some of the call outs on here, like the AGS, people say, well, what is that? It stood for A-Gas Supercharged. And of course, the Gasser classes no longer exist. B&M was a big person with transmissions back in the 60s. They're the ones that really introduced automatic transmissions to where they worked in a race car. And Jack Angle cams. Angle was a big cam manufacturer. They were part of the cam wars at the Gassers. All that stuff was in my mind and ended up on this car. The name Anxious. When I was 14 years old, I rode a bicycle up to a place over near where I lived in Maryland, and it was called Modifications Unlimited. It was all hot rod stuff. And the owner there had one of the old Fiat bodies, which were very popular back then. And this was an A-altered car. He had a blown Cadillac in it, and it was named Anxious. And I said, what a cool name for a race car. And again, I'm thinking back, 50 years, 60 years, whatever it is, years, and I just said, that's going to be its name. The pie crust tires, indicative of the 60s. The rims are real magnesium Americans, and the front, of course, are Halibrands, and they're all 15-inch. Those are 1050 15s, which means they're 10.5-inch wide slicks, which was about the biggest you could get back then. A straight front axle, just a solid chromoly tube, and of course, conventional shock absorbers, but it has like the old buggy spring, the parallel leaf springs. And of course I had everything chromed. I did go with the Willwood disc brakes in the front for safety. And in the rear, of course, I put the big Ford 9-inch truck brakes on the rear to try to slow this thing down. The rear end is a championship quick change rear. I can change gear ratios in about 15 minutes. It's really cool. You pull the back cover off, you just swap a couple gears around and put the rear cover back on. You're ready to race. A whole different ratio. That was the big advantage to the quick change rears, which was used back then.
And it's wild too, because I was reading something about these in 1941. They stopped production on these because of World War II, and they started putting their efforts towards the war efforts.
So absolutely,
it's pretty wild.
They built a lot of the deuce and a quarters you're familiar with, and deuce and a halves and all that. Studebaker built a lot of those. A lot of people didn't know Studebaker is one of the oldest car companies in the nation. They built horse and buggies is how they started out. But the end result is that finally they shut their doors in 1958 was the last Studebaker. Pipe rear bumper, a lot of people asked me about that. In the 50s and 60s, the tire technology was not that good. To get more traction, what they would do was they'd take those pipe bumpers, and if you look a lot of the old Gassers, they had the pipe bumper. And the idea was they'd take the cap off the end and cram about 400 pounds of shot into the rear bumper. Well, what that does, looking at physics, is puts a lot more weight on the rear axle.
So let's talk about the interior. Tell me what you got going on.
The initial impact that you see is either all the chrome in the dash. That's pretty much a stock Studebaker dashboard right up to the point of where the gauges are. Those are vintage Stuart Warner gauges. Vintage Sun tachometer mounted to the dash, Moon steering wheel, B&M shifter. These seats are actually out of a 64 Mustang, and we redid them in the diamond tuft type stitching. As you can see, it's everywhere, the back seat. And this was what they called a double date coupe.
What about that gas pedal? Because that thing is that's sweet. I've never seen that before.
That is, as it shows on it, that again is a Moon right out of the 50s and 60s. Let's make sure you planted your foot right in the right place and good and hard.
Even though you don't really race it, at least it really ties back to the history of that race car look. And it will still live on forever with this car, which is awesome for people to see, I feel like, at shows. And
I figure I did my job as far as emulating that era.
Yeah, and it's got to make you feel good. And plus, with the younger generation and the little kids coming around, for them to see this, like, oh, what is that? Oh, it's a Gasser. And then they start learning about that and the old history of drag racing and everything. I think it's pretty cool. So
yeah, a lot of people come up and just say, you hit the mark. I mean, that is the consummate 60s era Gasser.
Well, cool, man. I'm super excited to ride along with you in this thing, in this little piece of history. So let's throw a camera up in here and go for a cruise.
Let's do it.
Before we hop in the ride, we actually do have some merch available. So if you want to support the channel, you can go down in the links below. We have these shirts here, the vintage Hot Rod Heaven shirts. I actually screen print these here at the house. And then we have the OG Hot Rod Heaven shirts. So if you want to get those, help support the channel, it's all linked down below. Now let's get back into the video.
Second gear and it broke loose.
Spin the tires and you're like freaking not quarter throttle.
Yep. No, it wasn't anywhere near wide open,
one of the last videos I did with the 19-year-old kid, Alec. We were just talking about growing up in the American Graffiti era. And man, this, especially being in this car, I know it's like 40s and you know, it's the same era.
Well, that was the popular year cars back in the 50s and 60s. All the hot rods were 40s era cars and such, you know. And so this, you're living what I lived back in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s.
Which is awesome. I wish I could live back in that era so bad.
Oh yeah, man, you went to all the cruise-in spots, you know, the hamburger joints, hot shops, and Mighty Mo, and oh God, something back then it was like Little Tavern and all them, and I mean these places on a Friday and Saturday night will get absolutely jammed with hot rods. I mean, to where there was a waiting line to get off the main drag to get into the hangout, and they eventually, I mean, many times they called the cops and shoot us all out of there because of the traffic jam we were creating. But that was all part of the fun, you know. Like I say, it was the golden age, and we didn't know it, but we lived it. And now in retrospect, you see it and you remember those memories, and I mean, it really was the greatest time in the world for us, you know.
Oh my gosh, man.
Feel it breaking loose again.
Oh yeah,
you know,
real quick.
Doesn't take much to get it to want to turn its rear hides, you know.
That's so fun, man. Oh my gosh. And it just sounds so good.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you have a cool ride with a cool story, send us an email. We'll put it down here on the screen. Add some pictures in there, tell us a little backstory, and who knows, you might be able to be featured on the channel. Definitely send us an email. We'd love to see your rides and hear your stories. If you want to see more content like this, make sure that you like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.